I found out on my 30th birthday that my closest friend had been keeping a secret from me for 7 years, and the secret itself was not what broke my heart, it was the reason she had never told me. I want to be honest about something before I start. I have rewritten the beginning of this story 4 times now, and every version starts with me describing my friendship with Nora in a way that makes it sound like a movie friendship, the kind where two people are introduced, and you immediately understand that they are going to mean everything to each other. I keep doing that because it's true, and because I can't figure out how to tell you what happened without first making you understand what we were to each other. But I'm also aware that every person who tells a story about a friendship gone complicated starts by telling you how perfect the friendship was, and I don't want to do that in a way that feels manipulative or that front-loads the narrative with something designed to make the later parts hit harder. So let me just tell you the facts of it and trust that the facts are enough. Nora and I met in the second week of college, in a laundry room in our dormitory building at 11:30 on a Thursday night. I was trying to figure out how the machines worked, which should not have been as complicated as it was, and she was sitting on top of a dryer eating a granola bar and reading a paperback novel, and she looked up and said, "The one on the left eats quarters and never actually runs, use the middle one." I used the middle one. We talked for 40 minutes while our respective laundry went through cycles, and by the end of it, we had made plans to get breakfast the following morning. That was 12 years before the birthday. 12 years of the kind of friendship that becomes so woven into your daily life that you stop being able to locate where you end and it begins. Not in an unhealthy way, more in the way that certain people become part of the operating system of your life, rather than just one of the applications running on it. She was the person I called first when anything happened, good or bad, significant or trivial. She was the person who knew all of the versions of me, the one I was at 18, and the ones I became at 22 and 25 and 28. She had seen me through 2 serious relationships ending badly and one starting well. I had seen her through a career change and a family crisis and the specific low-grade depression that arrived in our mid-20s and sat on both of us for about a year before we figured out how to make it smaller. We had never had a significant falling out. That's not because we were identical or because we never disagreed. We disagreed fairly often and sometimes with real heat. But we had always found our way back to each other within days, usually hours, because the friendship was more important than whatever position either of us had staked out in the moment. I thought I knew her completely. I thought the word completely was applicable. I was wrong about that, and the wrongness of it was the thing I had to spend the longest time sitting with after my 30th birthday. The birthday itself was a Saturday in late March. Nora had organized the whole thing, which was typical of her because she organized things the way some people breathe, automatically and without visible effort. She had a genuine talent for it, for reading what a person actually wanted from a celebration rather than what they said they wanted, and executing it with a precision that felt personal rather than performative. For my 30th, she had organized a dinner at a restaurant I loved, with 8 people who were my closest friends, and afterward we had gone back to my apartment and stayed up too late talking and drinking wine, and doing the thing that happens at milestone birthdays, where everyone ends up reflecting on the past decade and what it added up to. It was a good night, I want to be clear about that. Whatever happened later, the night itself was genuinely good. I felt loved and seen and grateful in the specific way of milestone birthdays when everything goes right. Nora was the last to leave. She always was. It was a kind of tradition, the 2 of us staying up after everyone else had gone, doing the post-event debrief that had become a ritual at some point in our mid-20s. We sat on the floor of my living room with the remnants of the wine and the general comfortable disorder of an evening that had fully run its course, and we talked about the party and about the people who had been there and about the decade and what we thought 30 meant. At some point, somewhere around 2 in the morning, the conversation shifted. I can't reconstruct exactly how it shifted because conversations rarely shift with a clear moment that you can point to afterward. It moved the way conversations move in the deep night hours when the social energy is gone, and the guards are down and people say things that they have been not quite saying for a long time. She became quieter, not withdrawn exactly. Maury like she was making a decision about something in real time while we were talking. I noticed it and I asked her if she was all right. She said she was fine. I said she didn't seem fine in the particular way that you say that to someone you have known for 12 years and whose version of fine you recognize on sight. She looked at me for a moment and then she said, "There's something I've been meaning to tell you for a while." I asked her what it was. She said she needed a minute. That minute, or the stretch of quiet that I am calling a minute, felt long, not tense exactly. Maury waited. I was not alarmed. My instinct was that she was going to tell me something personal about her own life, something she had been working up to, some piece of her interior that she had been carrying privately and had decided tonight was the night to share. That was the register I was reading. What she actually said was this: She said that 7 years ago, in the period right after my first serious relationship ended, she had met the person I had been with, my ex, whose name was Daniel. She had met him by coincidence at a mutual acquaintances gathering, a situation she had not engineered and had not expected. She said they had talked and that he had told her something about the end of our relationship, about his version of why it had ended, that was significantly different from the version he had given me. She said she had thought about whether to tell me for a long time and had decided not to. And then she said that decision had been wrong, and she had known it was wrong for most of the 7 years since, and that she was telling me now, because she had been carrying the weight of not telling me for long enough that it had become a different kind of secret, not just about the original information, but about her own failure to share it when she should have. I sat with that for a moment, then I asked her what he had told her. She told me, "I am not going to reproduce the specifics here, because the specifics belong to that relationship and to those 3 people, and I have no interest in excavating them in detail in a public forum. What I will say is that what he had told her was not catastrophic. It was not the kind of information that would have fundamentally changed how I understood my own life or what had happened in that relationship. It was more in the category of context, something that would have added dimension to my understanding of why things had ended the way they had, that would have been useful and clarifying, and would have saved me from some portion of the self-directed analysis I did in the year following the breakup. It was not a betrayal, it was not a confession of something terrible, it was just information, useful, overdue information. And that is why the secret itself was not what broke my heart. What broke my heart was the reason she gave me for not telling me. She said she had been afraid that if she told me I would make it about her, that I would focus on the fact that she had met him and talked to him and held the information rather than on the information itself. She said she had been afraid of my reaction, afraid that I would be hurt and that the hurt would turn into something that damaged the friendship, and so she had said nothing. And then more time had passed, and the weight of the not saying had accumulated, and the fear had compounded because now it wasn't just a piece of information she hadn't shared, it was 7 years of not sharing it, which was a different and larger thing. I sat on the floor of my living room at 2 a.m. on my 30th birthday, and I heard her say that she had been afraid of my reaction for 7 years. That the friendship she had been protecting by not telling me was the friendship she was now admitting to me she had not trusted enough to be honest with. That she had managed my emotions in her own mind for 7 years from a distance, making decisions on my behalf about what I could and couldn't handle. And I did not know what to do with that. I want to be careful here because I am aware that how I tell this part of the story determines how you understand what happened next, and I don't want to be unfair to her. Nora is not a manipulative person. She is not someone who operates from bad motives. She is one of the most genuinely good-hearted people I have ever known, and the decision she made 7 years earlier, whatever I felt about it, came from a place of caring about me rather than from a place of wanting to control me or protect herself at my expense. But the thing about being afraid of someone's reaction for 7 years is that it tells you what that person actually thinks of you, underneath the friendship and the love and the 12 years of laundry rooms and late nights and everything in between. It tells you the specific shape of how they hold you in their mind. And the shape of how Nora held me in her mind was apparently as someone who could not be trusted with difficult information. As someone whose emotional reactions needed to be managed and anticipated and protected against. And I had had no idea. None. For 12 years I had been operating with a self-understanding that included the belief that my closest friend knew me and trusted me and gave me full credit for the adult that I was. And on my 30th birthday at 2 a.m, I found out that that belief had a specific and significant hole in it that she had been quietly maintaining for 7 years. I did not yell, I did not cry. I want to be accurate about this because I think the way a person responds to something like that says something about where they actually are. I said very little, actually. I asked a few clarifying questions. I told her I needed time to think about it. She left around 3. I sat on the floor of my living room for a while after she left, in the quiet aftermath of what had been, until an hour earlier, a genuinely good birthday. The weeks after that night were among the stranger ones I have spent inside a friendship. We did not stop talking. We did not have the kind of rupture that you might expect from a conversation like that one. But something had changed in the texture of the thing, a change I felt constantly, and that I suspect she felt too from her side, like a piece of furniture that has been moved slightly, and now the room doesn't feel quite right even though nothing obvious has changed. I spent a lot of time in those weeks thinking about the specific thing that was bothering me, trying to be precise about it rather than just sitting in a general, undifferentiated hurt. Because I knew the hurt was there, and I knew it was legitimate, but I also knew that hurt without precision has a tendency to expand into territory that doesn't belong to it, to accuse things that aren't actually at fault, to become a story that is larger and more damaging than the actual event warrants. So I tried to be precise. What I arrived at, after several weeks of thinking about it, with the kind of careful attention that 2 a.m. on a living room floor demands, was this. The secret itself was manageable. The 7-year duration of the secret was harder, but also manageable in the sense that I could construct a coherent picture of how it had happened, how a decision that felt reasonable in the moment had accumulated into something unwieldy over time. Those things I could hold and work with, and eventually arrive at a place of genuine understanding about. What was harder, what required more time and more honesty about my own feelings, was the question of what it meant that she had been afraid of me. Not of losing me, which would have been its own thing, afraid of me specifically, afraid of my reaction, afraid that my emotional response to information would be more significant and less manageable than the information itself. I sat with that word afraid for a long time. I turned it over the way you turn over something you found and are not sure whether to keep. Was she wrong? That was the question I kept arriving at. Was the fear unfounded, a product of her own anxiety rather than an accurate read of who I was? Or had I given her, at some point or over many points, genuine evidence that I was the kind of person whose reactions needed to be preemptively managed? That is not a comfortable question to ask yourself. It is the kind of question that requires a level of honesty that most of us avoid when the subject is our own behavior. I did not enjoy asking it, but I thought I owed it to both of us to try to answer it honestly rather than just to arrive at the comfortable conclusion that she had been wrong and that I was entirely blameless in the dynamic that had produced the situation. What I found, looking back over 12 years with that specific question in mind, was complicated. There were instances I could identify, moments across the years where my emotional reactions to things had been large enough or sharp enough that someone who cared about me might have reasonably noted them as something to factor in when deciding how to deliver difficult information. I had not been a consistently easy person to bring hard things to. I could see that, looking back with the question active. I had not been unreasonable or volatile in any serious way, but I had, in certain specific contexts, been reactive in ways that made the space around me smaller rather than larger. That recognition did not resolve my feelings about what Nora had done. Understanding that you may have contributed to a dynamic is not the same as absolving the other person of their choices within that dynamic. She had still made a decision to manage my emotions from a distance for 7 years, and that decision had still told me something about how she held me in her mind that I had not known before and could not unknow after. But it complicated the story in a way that felt important to acknowledge, rather than to flatten into a simpler version where I was only the wronged party, and she was only the person who had wronged me. The conversations we had over the weeks and months after my birthday were the hardest conversations of our friendship. Not loud. Nothing we went through was ever particularly loud, but difficult in the deep tissue way of two people who are trying to be honest with each other about things that require honesty about themselves first, and who care enough about the friendship to do that work rather than to let the discomfort resolve itself through distance. She explained her side more fully in those conversations, not as a defense exactly, more as an unpacking, an attempt to give me the interior of the decision that she had never been able to give me before. She talked about the specific fear, where it had come from, how it had developed over time from a single reasonable in-the-moment hesitation into something she had not fully examined. She talked about the ways she had rationalized the not telling across 7 years, the things she had told herself about timing and relevance, and whether it still mattered. She talked about the relief of having finally said it, and the shame of how long it had taken. I listened to all of it. I asked questions when I had them. I tried to receive what she was giving me with the fairness it deserved, which was easier on some days than on others. There is a particular kind of work that friendships require when something significant has shifted between two people, a work that is different from the ordinary maintenance of closeness that happens without effort when everything is fine. The ordinary maintenance is almost invisible. You show up for each other, you share the texture of your days, you laugh at the same things and care about the same people, and the friendship sustains itself on its own momentum the way healthy things do when they are genuinely healthy. You don't have to think about it, it just runs. The work I'm describing is different. It is deliberate and sometimes uncomfortable, and it requires a kind of sustained attention to the relationship itself, to the space between you rather than just to the content of what you share. It is the work of two people who have been knocked off their natural rhythm with each other and are trying to find their way back to something that feels genuine rather than performed. Nora and I did that work through April and into May. It looked from the outside, I imagine, like nothing in particular. We still saw each other. We still had our usual routines, the Sunday morning coffee that had been part of both our weeks for years, the occasional weeknight dinner when one of us had something to report or process, the ongoing text thread that had existed in some form since smartphones made ongoing text threads possible. But the quality of those interactions had a different texture than before, more careful, more conscious, like two people who were both slightly aware of where they were putting their feet. I want to describe a specific conversation that happened in late April, about 5 weeks after my birthday, because I think it was the conversation that moved things most meaningfully in the direction of something real. We were at the Sunday coffee, which we had at a place near her apartment that had good light in the mornings, and a corner table that we had effectively claimed through years of consistent occupancy. It was a Sunday that had the particular quality of late April Sundays, that specific combination of warmth and newness that feels like the world is making a genuine effort after a long cold stretch. We had been talking about other things, ordinary things, the surface texture of the week. And then there was a pause, the kind that had been appearing with more frequency since the birthday, pauses where both of us were navigating the gap between the comfortable old rhythm and whatever the new rhythm was going to be. I said, "I need to tell you something that I've been thinking about." She said okay, and gave me the quality of attention that she had always been good at, that full-bodied listening that was one of the things I had valued most about her for 12 years. I said, "I've been trying to figure out whether I'm angry with you or whether I'm sad, and I think the answer is that I'm mostly sad, and I think I'm sad about something specific that I want to try to explain correctly because I don't want to explain it wrong and have you respond to the wrong thing." She said she was listening. I said, "What's hard for me is not that you didn't tell me. I mean, it is hard, but I think I understand how it happened, and I can follow the logic of the accumulation even if I don't fully agree with the original decision. What's hard is the reason, the fear of my reaction, because what that tells me is that for some portion of the last 12 years, maybe the whole time, there's been a version of me in your head that is different from how I think of myself. A version that is harder to deal with, more reactive, less trustworthy with difficult things. And I've been operating this whole time thinking we were seeing each other clearly, and now I find out that there's been this gap between how you see me and how I see myself, and I don't know how to locate myself in the friendship anymore, because I don't know which version is the accurate one." I stopped talking. She was quiet for a moment, not the silence of not knowing what to say, but the silence of someone receiving something carefully. Then she said something that I have thought about almost every day since. She said, "I don't think it was a version of you that was wrong. I think it was a version of me that was wrong." She said she had been afraid not because I was genuinely frightening or unpredictable, but because she had her own specific anxiety around conflict and around the possibility of losing things she cared about, and that anxiety had attached itself to the situation in a way that had as much to do with her own history as it did with any actual evidence about how I would respond. She said she had been managing her own fear and calling it protecting me, and that was the thing she was most ashamed of. Not the not telling, the misattribution of motive, the telling herself it was about me when it was actually about her. I sat with that for a while. The coffee was getting cold. The morning light was doing its late April thing through the corner window. I said, "I appreciate you saying that, and I think it's probably true. And I also think it's possible for both things to be true at the same time, that your fear was mostly about your own stuff, and also that I gave you some material to work with over the years. I don't think I've always been easy to bring things to." She looked at me when I said that in a way that was slightly surprised, not in a theatrical way, just in the quiet way of someone registering something they hadn't expected to hear. And then she said, "That's probably fair." And I think that was the first moment in those 5 weeks where we were both in the same place at the same time, both being honest about our own contribution to the thing, rather than just explaining our own side of it. It didn't fix everything in that moment. Conversations rarely fix things in the moment, whatever the movies suggest, but it was a reorientation. A shift from two people defending adjacent positions to two people examining a shared situation from the same direction, and that shift mattered more than any specific resolution could have. What followed over the next several months was not a return to what we had been before. I want to be clear about that because I think there's a story that people tell about friendships that survive difficulty, which is that the difficulty makes the friendship stronger, and the friendship comes out on the other side more or less as it was, but with a new depth added, like a layer of varnish over something that was already good. That is a tidy story, and I understand its appeal. It is also, in my experience, not quite accurate to how things actually work. What we built after my 30th birthday was not the same friendship with added depth. It was a different friendship. Not worse, I want to be clear about that, but genuinely different, constructed from a more complete picture of who we each actually were, which meant it was in some ways more honest, and in some ways more effortful, and in some ways more fragile, and in some ways more solid. All of those things simultaneously, the way real things tend to be. I became more deliberate, in the months after that conversation, about being the kind of person who was easier to bring difficult things to, not performatively. I wasn't walking around announcing that I was working on my reactivity, more quietly than that, paying more attention to the space I created when someone was trying to tell me something hard, noticing when my first impulse was to make someone else's difficult information about my own feelings rather than about the thing they were trying to share. It is slow, uncomfortable work, the kind that doesn't produce visible results quickly, but I was committed to doing it because I thought it was true that it needed doing, independent of whatever had happened with Nora. She, for her part, was doing her own version of a parallel work. I noticed it in small ways first. She told me things more promptly, things she might have previously sat on for a few days while she decided how to approach them. She was more willing to be uncertain out loud rather than presenting me with conclusions she had already worked through privately. There was less management and more actual exchange, and even though the exchange was sometimes messier, it felt more real, and the realness of it was worth the messiness. I told a mutual friend of ours, a woman named Petra who had known both of us since college, a partial version of what had happened, enough for context, not more than was mine to share. Petra is someone who tends to respond to things with a directness that I find useful, the kind of friend who will tell you what she actually thinks rather than what she thinks you want to hear. She listened and then she said, I always thought you two were each slightly too careful around each other. I asked her what she meant. She said, not in a bad way, in a way that people are careful around things they value, like you were both slightly holding your breath around each other. I thought it was sweet, but I wondered sometimes if it was also a little bit fragile underneath. I thought about that for a long time after she said it, the slightly too careful observation. The possibility that the friendship I had believed was entirely solid had in fact been, in some way I hadn't registered, maintained partly through a mutual carefulness that was a cousin of the fear Nora had described, that we had both, independently, been managing the relationship rather than simply being in it. Managing our own behavior, managing each other's potential responses, protecting something precious through a layer of care that was also a layer of distance. I don't know if that's entirely true. Petra is perceptive, but she was also working from an outside view, and outside views have their own distortions, but I think there was something in it. Some truth in the observation that the friendship, for all its genuine closeness, had also been maintained through a kind of mutual protective effort that neither of us had examined or named. The examining and naming of it, which was what the year after my 30th birthday became in a way I hadn't anticipated when I'd spent the previous year looking forward to 30 as a milestone to be celebrated, turned out to be one of the more genuinely useful things I'd gone through. Not pleasant, not something I would have chosen, but useful in the way that clarity is always useful, even when it arrives through a path you wouldn't have picked. There was a specific weekend in late July, 4 months after the birthday, that I think of as the point at which the friendship had settled into its new shape enough that I could feel it rather than just conceptualize it. Nora and I had gone for a walk, a long one, through a part of the city we didn't usually spend time in, and the conversation had moved through its usual range, ordinary things and less ordinary things, and at some point we had passed through a stretch of easy silence that felt like it used to feel before the birthday, not the weighted, careful silences of the preceding months, but just the comfortable shared quiet of two people who didn't need to fill every moment. She said, at some point in that stretch, that she had been thinking about telling me something for about a week, and that she had told herself not to wait longer than a week before actually saying it. I asked her what it was. She said she had recently started thinking about leaving the city. Not immediately, not with a plan in place, but the thought had been arriving more frequently, and she wanted to tell me about it while it was still just a thought rather than waiting until it had become something more definite. She said she was mentioning it partly because she knew it would affect me, and she didn't want to be someone who managed that from a distance. I heard the reference in what she said. It was not pointed, not a performance of the lesson she had learned. It was just matter of fact, delivered as a statement of intent that also happened to demonstrate the work she had been doing. I'm telling you now, while it's still small, because that's what I want to do differently. I said I appreciate you telling me, and I meant it. We walked for another hour through the July afternoon, the city moving around us in its ordinary Saturday way, and we talked about what she was thinking and what was behind the thought, and what the city meant to each of us at this particular point in our lives. It was a real conversation, one that neither of us had to be careful around, and it covered things that would have been difficult to say in the previous version of the friendship for reasons I think I've explained by now. By the time we stopped for something to drink, sitting outside a small place on a side street, with the late afternoon light doing its long-angled summer thing across the pavement, something had settled between us in a way that I registered in my body before I registered it consciously. A kind of ease that was different from the old ease, less protected, more exposed in a way that turned out to feel better rather than worse. The old ease had been the ease of two people who knew each other well, and trusted that knowledge completely. The new ease was something more like the ease of two people who knew each other well, and also knew the limits of that knowledge, who had seen the places where the self-image and the other image didn't perfectly align, and had decided to stay anyway, not because the alignment was complete, but because the staying was more important than the perfection. That distinction, between staying because everything is fine and staying because the staying matters more than the fine, turned out to be something I thought about in contexts well beyond the friendship with Nora. It showed up in how I thought about my relationship with my own family, about where I had been asking for too much neatness, and not giving enough room for the actual complicated thing. It showed up in how I thought about other friendships, about the places where I had been maintaining a surface rather than showing up for the depth beneath it. It showed up in how I thought about myself, about the gap between the self-image I carried and the more complicated actual self that other people were apparently experiencing in ways I hadn't fully reckoned with. None of that would have been available to me without the birthday and the 2 a.m. conversation and the weeks of difficulty and the long, slow work of rebuilding something that had needed to be rebuilt. I would have continued in the comfortable old version indefinitely if the comfortable old version had been allowed to continue. That is the honest answer. I did not seek out the discomfort, and I would not have chosen it. But I am genuinely grateful for it, in the way that you're grateful for things that cost you something and give you something more in return. Nora did eventually leave the city. That happened about 1.5 years after my birthday, and when it happened, it was not a surprise because she had been telling me it was coming in the incremental, honest way she had developed over the preceding 18 months. The leaving was its own thing to navigate, a different kind of difficulty, the ordinary grief of physical distance arriving between two people whose friendship had been partly maintained through proximity. But we navigated it as we had learned to navigate things, directly and without too much management, and the friendship on the other side of the distance was real in a way that I think it might not have been without everything that had preceded the move. I talk to her twice a week. We visit twice a year, sometimes 3 times if schedules allow. The laundry room ease is still there, underneath everything, and it coexists with the harder-won things without contradiction. That is the specific gift of a friendship that has been through something and come out the other side intact. Not the same intact it was before, but a different and more complete kind of intact. The secret itself was about my ex, and about a conversation that happened 7 years ago, and that added some useful context to something I had already mostly made my peace with. I have thought about it since, and it has done the clarifying work that information does when it finally arrives, and then it has settled into the background where old useful information tends to settle. The reason she hadn't told me was about fear, and about a specific way she had been holding me in her mind, and about the self-examination that her honesty about that fear required of both of us, and about what that self-examination made available to the friendship afterward. That part has not settled into the background. That part I carry with me actively, not as a wound but as a kind of ongoing education, a reminder that the people who know us best are still working from incomplete information, and that we are working from incomplete information about them, and that the incompleteness is not a failure of the relationship, but a permanent condition of all relationships that the best ones learn to acknowledge. I turned 31 this March. Nora called at midnight, which she had done every birthday since we were 20, the timing so consistent that I had come to count on it the way you count on reliable things. We talked for an hour, and then she said she had something to tell me, and for a single irrational second, I felt the ghost of the previous year move through me. And then she said she had started seeing someone, a person she was genuinely excited about, and she had wanted to tell me while the excitement was still new rather than waiting until she was sure about it. I told her that was exactly the right call. She laughed, I laughed, the year moved on. I want to spend some time in this part of the story on something that I have been circling around without fully addressing, which is the question of what the whole experience taught me about the specific mechanics of how secrets work inside close relationships. Not secrets in the dramatic sense, not the kind that involve betrayals or catastrophic revelations, the ordinary kind. The information that gets held back not from malice but from love, or from fear, or from the particular human tendency to protect the people we care about from things we have decided, on their behalf, that they can't handle. I had thought about secrets before my 30th birthday in a fairly uncomplicated way. The framework I was operating from was essentially binary. Either you told the people you were close to the things they needed to know, or you didn't, and not telling them was a form of dishonesty that damaged trust. That framework had always seemed sufficient, because I had never had reason to examine it in detail. The friendships I had were honest, as far as I knew, and the question of what it meant to hold something back from someone you loved had always felt like a theoretical one, applicable to other people's relationships rather than to mine. After the birthday, I had reason to examine the framework more carefully. And what I found when I examined it was that it was significantly less sufficient than it had appeared. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that the binary, tell or don't tell, was almost never the actual choice that people faced. The actual choice was almost always more complicated, more textured, more entangled with context and timing, and the specific emotional history of the relationship and the person's own interior life. Nora had not decided in a single moment to keep something from me, and then maintained that decision cold-bloodedly for 7 years. She had made a decision in a specific moment that felt reasonable given the specific circumstances of that moment, and then that decision had been continuously renewed in small ways over years without ever being fully examined, accumulating through the path of least resistance rather than through any active intent to deceive. I think that is how most things accumulate, not through dramatic choices, but through the continuous renewal of small ones, each small renewal feeling too minor to revisit, each one adding another layer to something that becomes significant through sheer accumulation rather than through any single definitive act. Understanding that didn't make me less sad about the 7 years, but it made me understand them in a way that was more useful than just being sad about them. I started paying different attention after the birthday to the places in my own life where I was doing the equivalent thing, where I was holding something back not from bad intent, but from some version of the same fear-based logic, the calculation that telling would cost more than not telling, that the reaction would be harder to manage than the information warranted. I found those places more readily than I expected to. They were in my family relationships, in my other friendships, in the way I talked about myself to people I cared about. A consistent light editing of my own experience, a small ongoing management of what I presented and what I held back, done so automatically that I had never fully registered it as a choice. I want to describe one specific instance, because I think it illustrates the pattern more concretely than the general observation does. My mother and I are close, not in the same register as my friendship with Nora, but genuinely close, the kind of closeness that has grown and changed over the years as I've become an adult, and we've had to renegotiate the terms of the relationship from the parent-child dynamic of my childhood into something more mutual. She knows me well. She asks good questions. She is interested in my actual life rather than in a version of my life that makes her feel comfortable, which is not something all parents manage to offer and which I had always appreciated. And yet, when I thought about it carefully after the birthday, I realized that I had been consistently light-editing my emotional life when I talked to her for years. Not lying, not presenting a false picture, just selecting the parts that were resolved or resolving rather than the parts that were still raw and unfinished. Telling her about difficulties after I had already worked through the worst of them, which meant she was always getting the retrospective version rather than the real-time one. Protecting her from my unfinished difficulties out of a care for her that was, when I examined it, also a care for my own self-presentation. I didn't want to seem like someone who was struggling. I wanted to seem like someone who had struggled and figured it out. That is a very small secret, in the scheme of things. Nothing like 7 years of specific withheld information. But it was the same logic operating at a lower level of intensity, the same calculation being made, the same management of someone else's experience of me, in the name of protecting them from something I had decided they didn't need to carry. I don't think I was wrong, exactly, to be selective with my mother about real-time difficulty. There are reasonable arguments for not burdening parents with the unprocessed texture of your adult struggles. But I think I had been doing it more completely and more consistently than was actually necessary, and that the completeness of it had created a version of our relationship where she was always working from a slightly cleaned-up picture of who her daughter was, which meant the closeness we had, genuine as it was built on a surface that was smoother than the actual thing. I changed that gradually in the year after my birthday. Nothing dramatic. I didn't call her up to confess an inventory of withheld struggles. I just started telling her things closer to when they were happening, before I had resolved them, when they were still messy and uncertain, and I didn't know what they were going to become. The first few times felt uncomfortable in a way that was surprisingly specific, a kind of vulnerability that I was not used to experiencing with her, because I had spent years managing it away. But she received the messier version of me with a consistency and a warmth that I should probably have predicted and had apparently not fully trusted. That, I realized, was my own version of Nora's fear, not identical, but structurally related, a version of not quite trusting someone I loved with the full complicated truth of what I was going through, dressed up as consideration for them, when it was also, at least in part, a protection of my own preferred self-image. The year after my 30th birthday was, in ways I had not at all anticipated when I was looking forward to the birthday as a simple celebration, one of the most genuinely educational years of my adult life, not because anything enormous happened. The things that happened were almost entirely ordinary in their scale: a secret told, conversations had, gradual adjustments made to how I showed up in the relationships that mattered to me. None of it would read as significant from the outside. All of it felt significant from the inside, in the slow, accumulating way that actual change tends to feel, rather than in the sharp, dramatic way that we are culturally conditioned to associate with transformation. I want to talk about Daniel, my ex, for a moment, because he has been present in this story from the beginning as the occasion for the secret, and I have deliberately not said much about him because the story is not about him. But there is one thing that happened in connection with him that I think belongs here. About 8 months after my birthday, I ran into him. Not arranged, just the ordinary coincidence of a city where two people who once knew each other both continue to live and move around in overlapping geography. We were at the same farmer's market on a Saturday morning, and we saw each other across a row of vegetable stalls, and there was the brief mutual recognition and the slightly awkward moment of deciding what to do with it. We got coffee. It was his suggestion, and I agreed because I was curious, and because 8 months of work on my own reactivity had apparently produced enough in the way of results that the prospect didn't feel threatening. We sat for about 45 minutes. It was mostly ordinary, the catching up conversation of two people who had once been important to each other and had moved into different lives. At the end of it, almost as an afterthought, I told him that I knew about the conversation he had had with Nora years ago. I said it without accusation or drama, just as a fact I was mentioning in passing. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said he had always wondered if she would eventually tell me. I asked him why he had told her in the first place at that gathering when they barely knew each other. He said he hadn't planned to. He said the conversation had gone somewhere unexpected, and he had said something he hadn't fully intended to say, and then it was out there and he hadn't known what to do with that. He said he had assumed she would tell me, and then she hadn't, and time had passed, and it had become too late to do anything about it. I thought about that on the walk home. The specific image of information that passes between two people and then sits between them indefinitely, both of them aware of it, neither of them sure what to do with it, time making the situation harder to address rather than easier, until it accumulates into something that a third person eventually has to sort through. That is such a human situation. That is such a recognizable version of how things go wrong between people, not because of bad intentions, but because of the accumulated small inactions that feel easier in the moment than the alternatives. I don't hold anything against Daniel for the original conversation with Nora. It was a complicated situation, handled imperfectly by people who were doing their best with what they had. That is the description of most situations involving humans. And I have learned, in the year after my birthday, to find that description more comforting than I used to rather than more damning. There is something I want to say about the specific way that reaching 30 clarified things for me, beyond and separate from the specific birthday conversation with Nora. I had been approaching 30 with the particular mix of anticipation and anxiety that milestone birthdays tend to produce, the cultural weight of the number, combined with the genuine question of whether you had done enough, or become enough, or understood enough in the decade leading up to it. I had spent probably too much of the preceding year measuring myself against some implicit standard of what 30 was supposed to look like, and finding the measurement alternately satisfying and concerning depending on the day. What the birthday actually gave me was not a resolution of that measurement. It didn't answer the question of whether I had done or become or understood enough. It just deposited something new into the situation that required a different kind of attention than the one I had been paying. Instead of measuring myself against an external standard, I found myself doing the internal inventory that Nora's honesty had made necessary, looking not at my accomplishments or my life circumstances, but at the specific textures of how I was in my relationships, and what those textures said about me, and whether they were actually what I wanted to be true about myself. That shift from external measurement to internal examination was the real gift of the year. Not comfortable, not something I would have chosen, but genuinely useful in a way that no number of satisfying external measurements could have been. I am 31 now. The friendship with Nora is in its new shape, different from what it was and more honest than what it was, and I have learned to appreciate the difference even when the honesty is uncomfortable. My relationship with my mother is closer in the ways that matter most, which is to say it is closer to actual rather than to performed. My other relationships, the ones I have examined in the light of what the birthday year required, are in various stages of the same kind of gradual adjustment, nothing dramatic, all of it slow and effortful and worth it. I still think about the fear, Nora's fear of my reaction, my fear of my mother's view of me if she saw the unresolved versions. the general human habit of managing the perceptions of the people we love rather than just showing up for them in the full complicated actual truth of ourselves. I think about it as a kind of ongoing weather condition rather than a problem to be solved, something to be aware of and to work with rather than to eliminate, because I don't think it can be eliminated. It is part of how people operate inside the intimacy of close relationships, the constant negotiation between self-protection and genuine exposure, between the version of yourself that you want to project and the version that is actually there. What I think I have learned in the year after 30 is not how to eliminate that negotiation, but how to be more honest about the fact that it is happening, to see it when it is happening, to name it to myself, and occasionally to override it in favor of the scarier, more exposed alternative. Not always, not perfectly, but more than before. The laundry room in the dormitory building where Nora and I met is not there anymore. The building was renovated a few years ago, and the laundry facilities were moved to a different floor and reconfigured. I know this because we walked past it once, a few years back, and she pointed it out. We laughed about it, the way you laugh about the specific locations of significant things, when the locations no longer exist in the form they had when they were significant. But the 11:30 Thursday conversation is still there, in the sense that it is still part of both of us, still part of the operating system of a friendship that has been running for 12 years, and that has survived, among other things, a 2 a.m. conversation on a birthday, and everything it required of us after. I am glad she told me. I am glad I heard it. I am glad we did the work. I am glad it changed things rather than leaving them as they were, even though the way they were had seemed fine, had seemed more than fine, had seemed like something I could count on completely. Completely is a dangerous word when applied to human relationships. I understand that now in a way I didn't on the evening before my 30th birthday, when I was sitting in a restaurant I loved, surrounded by my closest people, feeling certain about things that were about to become considerably less certain. The uncertainty, it turned out, was where the real stuff was. The real stuff is always a little less tidy than the certain version, but it is considerably more alive. There is a question I have been asked several times since the birthday year, by people I have told portions of this story to, and the question is always some version of the same thing. Do you think she should have told you sooner? It is always delivered with the slight upward inflection of a question that is also an invitation, an opening for me to say yes, and to have the questioner nod in the way that people nod when they get the answer that confirms what they already thought. And every time I hear it, I notice the shape of it, the invitation toward the simpler version of the story, the one where Nora was wrong and I was the wronged party, and the lesson is about honesty and the importance of telling people what they need to know. I always pause before I answer, not for effect, because the honest answer genuinely takes a moment to locate. The honest answer is yes, and also it is more complicated than yes. Yes, in an ideal version of the situation, the information would have been shared sooner, and the fear that prevented it would not have been present or would have been overridden earlier. That is true. But the honest answer also includes the acknowledgement that the version of our friendship that existed before the birthday conversation, the version I had believed was complete, was built partly on a mutual carefulness that I had participated in constructing. And that carefulness had its own value, had held us together through 12 years of the ordinary difficulty of two people remaining close across all the changes that a decade produces. The carefulness had been, for a long time, genuinely functional. It had protected something worth protecting. It had just also, over time, become something that was keeping the friendship at a distance from its own potential. So when people ask me if she should have told me sooner, the real answer is yes. And also we both should have been doing something differently for longer than 7 years. And also the specific something that needed to be different would have been very hard to identify without the birthday conversation that finally revealed it. That is not a satisfying answer for people who want the simpler version. I understand that. Simple versions of complicated things are appealing because they provide a clear allocation of fault and a clear lesson to take away. This story does not offer that, and I have stopped trying to give it a shape it doesn't have. I want to spend some time in this final stretch talking about what happened to me professionally in the year after my birthday, because I have told the story so far almost entirely in the register of my personal relationships, and left out the fact that the examination I was doing of myself during that year extended into other areas of my life as well. I worked at the time of my birthday in market research. I had been doing it for 4 years at a mid-sized firm, the kind of work that requires genuine analytical intelligence and produces results that matter to the clients but that had never, even on the best days, felt like something I had been specifically made to do. It paid well, the people were largely good, the work was interesting enough on a case-by-case basis. I had been telling myself for most of 4 years that it was fine, that not every job needed to be a calling, that the things I cared about most lived outside the work anyway, and the work's purpose was to fund and support those things rather than to be one of them. That story had been sufficient for 4 years. In the year after my birthday, it stopped being sufficient, not because anything changed externally. The job was the same, the pay was the same, the people were the same. What changed was that I had spent several months doing the kind of internal examination that Nora's honesty had made necessary, and I had developed, through that examination, a lower tolerance for the gap between the story I was telling myself and the thing I was actually experiencing. The story I was telling myself about the job was that it was fine, and that fine was enough. The thing I was actually experiencing was a low-grade, persistent sense that I was not in the right place, that the specific shape of my attention and my curiosity and the things I was genuinely good at were not being used in the ways they were capable of being used, that I was functioning at a fraction of whatever my actual capacity was, and had been telling myself that fraction was acceptable when it wasn't. I want to be clear that this is not a story about leaving a job and finding a calling. I don't have a tidy professional transformation to report. What I have is something more gradual and less dramatic, which is that I started paying different attention to the work I was doing and the work I was not doing, and began making small changes in the direction of the gap. I had, for several years before my birthday, been doing a kind of informal writing on the side, not for publication, not with any specific audience in mind, just thinking through things in prose as a way of processing them. I had always found writing to be how I understood things rather than a record of things I had already understood. The notebook I kept during the birthday year was part of that practice, a place where I worked through what was happening in the friendship and what I was learning from it, in the same way that I worked through other things in the journals I had kept since I was about 20. Sometime in the summer after my birthday, I started paying more serious attention to that practice, not as a potential career exactly, more as something that deserved more of my deliberate attention than I had been giving it. I started writing longer, more developed pieces, still not for publication, but with more care and more craft than the journals required. I started reading about writing, about the specific work of putting experience into prose in a way that was honest without being indulgent, specific without being private, personal in the way that connects rather than in the way that isolates. I shared some of it eventually, which was its own version of the same work I had been doing in my personal relationships. The management of what I presented and what I held back, the fear of the reaction, the decision to override the fear in favor of the more exposed alternative. I showed something to Petra first, because she had the particular quality of honest response that I needed and that I trusted. She read it and then she said, "This is actually good," and she said it in the way she says things, which is without surplus softness. I showed it to Nora. I showed it to my mother. I'm not going to tell you that this story ends with a professional transformation where the writing took over and everything fell into place. That would be the satisfying version, and it would not be true. What is true is that I made a space for something that mattered to me that I had been keeping small, and that making the space changed the quality of my daily life in ways that were not about career outcomes or external recognition. The work itself was the thing. The showing up for it was the thing. The practice of being honest on the page about experience in real time, rather than waiting until the experience was resolved and comfortable, which turned out to be the same practice I was developing in my relationships, just running through a different channel. I think about the parallel often, the willingness to be unfinished out loud, whether the out loud is a conversation with a friend or a page of writing, or a phone call to a mother at a moment when nothing is resolved yet. The same underlying thing expressing itself in different forms, the decision to let what is actually happening be visible rather than waiting until it has been cleaned up and made presentable. That decision, in its various forms, was what the year after my 30th birthday kept returning me to. Not a single lesson learned once, more like a theme that kept appearing in different registers, the same note played in different octaves, until I understood it not just intellectually, but in the way that you understand things when they have been demonstrated to you enough times across enough different contexts. There is one more thing I want to say about The Secret specifically, the original piece of information that started all of this. I have been deliberately not dwelling on its content, because I said early on that the content was not the point, and I believe that. But I want to say something about what happened when I finally had the information, when I incorporated it into my understanding of that relationship and its ending and what it had meant. What happened was smaller than I had imagined it would be, not meaningless. The information did the clarifying work that Daniel had intended it to do when he told Nora 7 years earlier, gave some shape to things I had wondered about, filled in some of the gaps in my understanding of how that particular relationship had been going while I was in it, and why it had ended the way it had. That was real and useful. But by the time I received the information, the wound it might have addressed was already healed, or healed enough that the information arrived into scar tissue rather than into the open thing it might have found 7 years earlier. I was a different person than I had been at 23. The relationship and its ending had been processed through years of living that included other relationships and other experiences, and a gradually developing understanding of myself that made the 23-year-old's pain feel like something from a different version of me rather than something I was still carrying. I say this not to minimize the value of the information or the validity of the conversation Nora and I had about it. Both of those things mattered, but the information itself, the specific content of what Daniel had said, arrived at a moment when it could be received quietly rather than with any of the intensity it would have carried in the years immediately after it happened. That quietness was its own gift, actually. It meant I could look at it clearly, without the distortion of active pain, and see it for what it was, which was context. Useful, dimension-adding context, nothing more and nothing less. And the 7 years of not having it, which had once seemed like a straightforward harm, I understood differently in the light of how and when I finally received it. The timing was not ideal, but it was also in the specific way that imperfect things sometimes are, not without its own kind of rightness. If Nora had told me at 24, 25, or 27, the conversation it would have produced would have been different from the conversation it produced on my 30th birthday. Possibly useful in its own way, but not the same conversation, not the one that required of both of us what this one required, not the one that changed the friendship in the specific ways it needed to be changed. I don't want to suggest that the timing was secretly perfect, or that everything happened as it should have. It didn't. An earlier telling would have been better, I believe that. But I can hold that belief alongside the acknowledgement that the imperfect timing produced something real that I am genuinely grateful for, and that gratitude doesn't require the imperfection to have been ideal. I turned 31 and 32. Nora is in her city, I am in mine. We talk twice a week and visit when we can. She is still with the person she told me about at midnight on my 31st birthday, and the relationship has, from what I can observe from a distance, the particular quality of something that is genuinely right for both people involved rather than something either of them is working at making right. I am glad for her in the specific and uncomplicated way that you are glad for people you love when the good thing they deserve finally arrives. I am still in the market research job, though in a different and more senior capacity than I was at 30, with a scope that gives me more room to use the parts of my attention that were being underused. The writing continues, in the journal and in other forms, and has produced some things I am proud of and many more things that are practice, and that serve their purpose as practice regardless of what they become. My mother knows more of me now than she did 2 years ago, and the relationship is better for it in ways I had predicted intellectually before I experienced them emotionally. Knowing something is good for a relationship, and actually doing the thing that is good for the relationship are, it turns out, not the same thing, and the distance between them is wider than it sounds. I have been working at closing the distance. I am not finished. Petra told me recently, in her characteristic way of saying things directly and then moving on, that I seemed more like myself than I used to. I asked her what she meant. She said, you used to have this quality of being slightly ahead of yourself, like you were always anticipating the next thing rather than being in the current thing. She said lately I seemed more present. I sat with that for a while and I think she was right, and I think I know where the change came from. It came from a 2 a.m. conversation on a birthday. It came from information that arrived 7 years late, and the examination of why it had been late, and what that examination required of me. It came from the slow work of adjusting the distance between the story I told about myself and the thing I actually was. It came from a dozen Sunday morning coffees, and a long July walk, and a midnight phone call, and all the small ordinary moments of a friendship being rebuilt into something more honest than what it had been before. None of that looks like much from the outside. From the outside, it is just 2 women who have been friends for a long time, talking on the phone twice a week, visiting twice a year, navigating the ordinary geography of a long friendship across physical distance and changing lives. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would attract much attention. From the inside, it is one of the things I am most proud of in my adult life, the staying with it, the willingness to do the work when the work was uncomfortable and the outcome was not guaranteed, the decision, made repeatedly across a year, to choose the more exposed and honest version rather than the managed and protected one. I think that is the real thing the birthday year gave me in the end, not a lesson learned and filed away, more of an ongoing practice, a direction to keep moving in imperfectly and with frequent backsliding, and without any destination that can be declared reached and finished. Just the practice itself, renewed each time the easier alternative presents itself, and I choose the harder one instead. The laundry room conversation is still there. 12 years in, and it is still the foundation, still the thing that everything was built on and rebuilt from. A Tuesday night in a dormitory basement, a stranger on a dryer with a granola bar, and the middle machine that actually runs. I think about that sometimes when I am on the phone with her, the ordinary Tuesday or Thursday call, nothing particular happening, both of us just talking in the way that people talk when they have been talking for long enough that talking is simply what they do. The granola bar, the machine that actually runs. The 40 minutes that became 12 years and whatever comes after 12 years, which is just more of the same, which is just the friendship continuing to be what it is, imperfect and revised, and more honest than it was, and more itself for the honesty. That is enough, that is more than enough, that is actually everything.